Stories, and normally Dick Fluke would be standing up here because Dick is the chairman of this committee for Life Stories. However, he is under the weather this morning, so he has asked me to punt for him. So I'm going to introduce our life story for today. The title, Kalamazoo and the Queen-Sized Bed. How many are intrigued? Good. So a little background on our speaker today, David Dunstone. He grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, went to the University of Michigan, spent time in the Army, and returned to the University of Michigan to finish his BS degree. Then on to Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis. Following medical school, he spent a year at Bronson Hospital on a general rotating internship and a 3-year residency in psychiatry at the University of Michigan. Dr. Dunstone was in private practice of psychiatry in Kalamazoo from 1974 to 1993, and in 1993 the practice became part of the Michigan State University Kalamazoo Center for Medical Studies. Dr. Dunstone has held academic appointments with Western Michigan University School of Social Work, the Michigan State University College of Human Medicine, and the Western Michigan University Homer Stryker. He's a Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine. Okay. Now for the important portion of this introduction. Dave and Deb Dunstone met at Veterans Hospital, Indianapolis, when he was doing one of his rotations, and Deb was in nursing school, working as a nurse's aide. Their anniversary, by the way, was 2 days ago, Monday, April 4th. Happy anniversary. Deb and David have 2 children, Matt, who lives in Michigan, and Betsy, who lives in Ohio. Both are married with 2 children each. The Dunstones came to Friendship Village, Kalamazoo on May 7, 2021, moving from their home of 21 years on 7 wooded acres near Eagle Lake. Friendship Village residents, please welcome Dr. David Dunstone, who will present Kalamazoo and the Queen-Sized Bed.
Thank you. Well, you can hear me?
Wait, we gotta turn your, I gotta turn your microphone on. No, we can't.
Actually, I can speak loudly enough that you could, well.
There you are.
Good morning. So in the run-up to our move to Friendship Village, we thought a lot about continuing care retirement communities and told our kids that we were thinking about doing this, and they were on board. So along the way, we were invited to spend a night at one of them, and we did that in Indianapolis, in actually Carmel, Indiana, north of Indianapolis. And they brought us dinner and so forth, and as the sun is setting, I'm sitting out on the patio, looking at a chain link fence about 50 feet away, and a shopping mall across the way where people are moving around, and trying to think about what we would hear the next day with our visit there. And the question that sort of began to run through my mind then, and has stuck with me, is what would be the quality of my day if we were to do that? And that's the quote from Thoreau here, right? I'll also say that since I retired close to 5 years ago, I've taken some weaving classes at the Kalamazoo Institute of Art. And one of my recent projects is a wall hanging, and the detail of that is to the right of this picture. It incorporates my neckties from 43 years of medical practice. So that's the quote from Thoreau. To affect the quality of the day, that's the highest of the arts. What I'd like to do is to talk to, in the life stories idea, so what themes are important to all of us here at Friendship Village? And maybe some of what you'll hear about the medical story will fit in with some of those ideas that you have. So the filter is a history of the practice of medicine in Kalamazoo, about doctors, hospitals, healthcare systems, certainly psychiatry, the community and us. We'll talk about plagues and science and the politics of plagues and science along the way, because we're all experiencing a lot about that these days, right? And about continuing care, retirement communities, and us. So, some disclosures. I am the son of a psychiatrist, and my dad is from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, from the Houghton-Hancock area, and his grandfather emigrated from Cornwall in the western side of England, which was mining country in the mid-1840s, 1850s. So he graduated from Dollar Bay High School and made his way down to Hillsdale College in the lower part of Michigan for 4 years, stayed on to live in Marshall and teach algebra for a year or two, and make his way to medical school in Ann Arbor. And while he was in Ann Arbor in medical school, he got room and board by living at the Ypsilanti State Hospital, which is about 6 miles south of Ann Arbor. So my sister, who is 2 years older than me to the day, and I, can say we were born in a state hospital. And in fact, an early memory, I think, is of walking hand in hand with her and looking down at a lower window and into what's really basically an industrial kitchen, in which the employees had pooled their sugar ration cards, this is during the war, to make a birthday cake for the medical superintendent and his two children. So while in medical school, he met a nurse from Chelsea, Michigan, named Ruth Frederica Minerva Vogel. And her great-grandfather had emigrated from Stuttgart, from Pleiningen, actually a suburb of Stuttgart, in the mid-1850s. And he was a weaver. That's the only thing I've ever known about him, but he's buried in the Chelsea Cemetery. And so they met while he was in medical school, married, and eventually moved to, he did locum tenens in state hospitals in Pontiac and in Coldwater, and then decided to go into private practice in Fort Wayne, moved there with his families, and I was 4, I think, when we moved to Fort Wayne. Grew up there to the extent that I've still grown up. Went to the public schools. I remember that when I finished 8th grade, my sister had done that 2 years before me, the principal took my mother to one side and said, "Mrs. Dunstone, I just want you to know that your children are 2 of the most normal children we've had." So, it turns out I went off to the University of Michigan after graduating high school, where things had been probably too easy for me. Missed my grades at the end of the first semester, and my father took me up and we had a talk with the dean, who said, "So, how does it feel to be a failure at age 18? It didn't feel very good at all. So somewhere along the line, I got to sit out for a semester, went back to school, did pretty well, and then had the same problem again and flunked out now twice. Sitting with the dean, I said, "What do you think I should do?" And he said, "I don't care, you're done. It's not up to me." So this is 1961. What's going on in the world then? Well, there's a Vietnamese war, right? War in Vietnam, and I'm on the draft list. So I decided to sign up. I took some tests at the beginning of that, and in basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, they sat me down about the tests and said, "Well, you did well enough, we could send you to officer candidate school. Or you did pretty well on the college, the language aptitude tests. We could send you to the Army Language School. Or you did pretty well on these spatial things, we could send you to the motor pool." I opted for the language school. Spent a year in Monterey, California, studying Korean. And then at the end of that year, so that was 5 days a week, 6 hours a day, in which from the very first day, no English was spoken in the classroom. And we saw nothing written for at least the first 6 weeks. But at the end of that time, while I was there, something called the CID was wandering around Fort Wayne, Indiana, asking my teachers and pastors whether I had a good model of citizenship and so forth. And I discovered that by the end of that, I had a top secret cryptographic clearance and went in for training about communications intelligence before landing in a suburb of Seoul, Yeongdong-po, at the 508th Army Security Agency compound, where I became a Korean translator and cryptanalyst. We were monitoring shortwave radio broadcasts of the North Korean Navy, and that was all in 2-digit codes that needed to be analyzed before they could be translated. So I spent 15 months in Korea doing that. Do any of you speak Korean? Do any Korean speakers? Okay, if you look along the right line of that photograph of me at age 21 or 22, it says, "Nuwaso sawaga chocholo torachigi kirar입니다." There is somebody lying under a tree, waiting for an apple to fall by itself. I sort of adopted that as a pretty good description of who I had been up to then. So, we're going to talk about politics, and as my wife and many of you know me by now, lots of stories. I do tell stories. We'll see how that goes. Doctors, hospitals, healthcare systems, psychiatry. So, in 1968, in medical school in Indianapolis, we began our clinical rotations. My first one was in a VA hospital on an internal medical rotation where I met this nurse from Jasper, Indiana, and we began engaging with one another over that time. And so by the end of medical school, actually by 1969, I was looking for internships. Where would I go? And one of the places that I considered was Kalamazoo, Michigan. We were invited to visit Kalamazoo. They put us up in the Holiday Inn that was on Crosstown Boulevard. You remember that? And on a Friday morning in November, a snowy Friday morning in November, I was picked up by Bob Nicholson, who was a pediatrician and doing the medical education for the hospital, and taken to pediatric grand rounds. We walked into the Harding Auditorium was full of doctors who were there for what's called a grand rounds. This is about pediatrics. And in the grand rounds tradition, an intern would present a difficult case that had ended badly. One of the staff physicians would discuss the case. And at the end of the conference, the pathologist would give the report about what they discovered, the pathology report about what had really happened. So these grand rounds could be surprisingly challenging, and to have local physicians who practice together challenging one another and saying, you know, you're responsible for the death of this person was very surprising. So this medical student walks into the pediatric grand rounds, and within 5 minutes they asked me to come down and discuss the case. Of course, I wasn't quite prepared to do that, but I fumbled through some piece of all of that. And eventually we showed up in Kalamazoo. The internship at Bronson Hospital had me first assigned to the emergency room. And my assignment was 24 hours on, 24 hours off for the first month. It turned out that month in Kalamazoo, Michigan, there was a motorcycle gang war on the north side of town. I don't know what we thought about this community and what was going on, but discovered that of 2 hospitals, that most of the people who were hurt by that went to Borges Hospital, and most of the police officers that were involved in it went to Bronson Hospital. So becoming aware of the difference in the 2 hospitals of this community and sort of made us aware that this was a community that had much diversity of things going on in it. And we just kept learning more and more about that. So let me say a bit more leading up to the state hospital question. During my residency in Ann Arbor, maybe 6 months from the end of it, I was offered the possibility of doing a forensic rotation, meaning the relationship between psychiatry and the law. A young 18-year-old man in Jackson, Michigan, had put a sawed-off shotgun into the window of a car and killed a black man and was arrested for first-degree murder. His attorneys were wondering about having him be able to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and thus they needed a psychiatrist who would be willing to do the evaluation, and I got to do that. I was led by one of my supervisors through this whole process, and I went to the Jackson County Jail with a reel-to-reel tape recorder under my arm, met this young man, interviewed him for quite a long time, and did that several more times in the process of coming to trial. And in the trial in Jackson County, it turned out I spent 6 hours on the witness stand, describing what I could about this young man and his psychology and his family background, and putting the pieces together that would lead us to him doing this thing, and him not being aware of what was going on when he did that. The psychiatrist for the prosecution was a man named Bill Decker from Kalamazoo State Hospital. And Bill Decker spent 20 minutes on the witness stand, in which he said, first of all, that I was a junior psychiatrist and didn't really know very much about what I was talking about. And 2, that he had spent 20 minutes interviewing this person, and because he was oriented and so forth on the day that he was interviewed, he must have been oriented and so forth on the day that he did this, so he was guilty, not insane. The jury found him guilty. And the judge said, I cannot send somebody as ill as he is to Jackson Prison. He sentenced him to the county jail. So that was my introduction to forensic psychiatry, but to Dr. Decker as well. Within a few months of my arrival in Kalamazoo, much later, and beginning my practice, I was called by Dr. Decker and asked to visit him at the state hospital. Would I do that? Sure. He was interested, I think, in having me help him teach occupational therapy students from Western Michigan University. But I showed up and went into this huge waiting area. I don't know if any of you have been to the state hospitals of that internet, but it was full. There were probably 12 or 15 women at desks doing secretarial things, and over here, a window where I could go. So I walked up to the window and said, I'm Dr. And I got about all that far, and I heard all this noise behind me. Each of those women were standing at attention. I thought my mother would be so proud. It's the only time that had ever happened to me. So I went off, so came back, we did the internship, went off for a residency, had a house in Ann Arbor. While in Ann Arbor, we had a neighbor, a couple that had children about the same time we were having babies. It turns out he was a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School who had an externship with a federal judge named Ensign. Is that his name? Ensign. And there was something going on in Kalamazoo, Michigan about cross-district busing. So that was really the first we heard about troubles in Kalamazoo, although we'd spent a year here for our internship. And now back in Kalamazoo in practice, I'm hearing about that in my office a lot. Another thing that happened somewhere along the way, actually some of the history is in 1968, there was a book published called, I'm going to block on it now, in Mental Health. That was the report of the Eisenhower Commission to President Kennedy about the situation in mental hospitals across the country. And it was recommending, to a great extent, especially because of all the medications that seem to be coming out, to close the state hospitals and to create a mental health system. I learned that that had happened in Kalamazoo with the creation of a community mental health system by essentially pulling together social service agencies that were already in existence. Orphans Home, Family and Children's Services, the guidance clinic, and to create the system, the mental health system that way. So when I got to Kalamazoo, I walked into that. The state hospital was being empty. During my internship in Kalamazoo, there were 6,000 patients at the Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital on 2 campuses, one, the main one on Oakland Drive, and the other, the Northwest unit, over off Main Street, by Douglas Avenue, 6,000 patients. There were 19 of those state hospitals across the state of Michigan, and now there are 2. One is in Kalamazoo, and when I last heard, they had 250 patients there, each of whom had been brought to that hospital by being found not guilty by reason of insanity for a capital offense. So that's some of what happened with the state hospital itself and the mental health system over that time. And many of you know about all that. Some don't know very much at all about that system and how it goes on. But we moved into Kalamazoo in '74, bought a house on Wade Avenue in the Winchell neighborhood. And I learned that one of my neighbors was a fellow named Bill Burrian. Is that a name that means anything to any of you? Bill was a social worker, and really, if the world of social work was involved with some people who became therapists and some people who became involved in systems and how they worked and how they might be changed, he was of the latter variety, and he became the founding dean of Western Michigan University's College of Health and Human Services. Human Sciences, So I had not been there very long before Bill and I met. And he encouraged me as a psychiatrist to think about becoming a member of the Community Mental Health Board. I thought I represented a conflict of interest about that. I was making money by seeing people doing this. The board insisted not. So I did that for the next the first 2 or 3 years of my practice. I was on the Mental Health Board and learned a lot about the community from that perspective. So how do we get to the queen-size bed?
I can't remember.
At some point in all of this, I recognized, having grown up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, I thought Kalamazoo was quite like Fort Wayne, which at one time had won an award of the country's happiest city. And Kalamazoo seemed to be very similar to all of that. But I was hearing all this discord. Fights between the hospitals, fights on the north side of town, people moving to Portage. Those were tough times here. Okay, so when we dated and moved towards getting married, the discussion was, do we buy a full-size bed, or a queen-size bed, or a king-size bed? And somewhere early on, we visited my sister in Denver, now having gone through a bitter divorce. And she put us up in their king-size bed. And we discovered we didn't need to run into each other all night long. So Kalamazoo, I would say, is a queen-sized, bed-sized town where we do have to run into each other. even in the midst of a lot of controversy, and figure out how to make our way through that. Thus the title. Okay? Enough time there. Interned at Bronson Hospital. Along the way, we met a couple who were interning at Borges Hospital. And there was a Southwest Michigan Area Health Education Cooperative that sort of tried to coordinate some of these efforts at graduate medical education. They showed us around the hospital, and I recognized that that year was the year that Borges Inpatient Psychiatric Unit was constructed, and it was constructed with federal funds from a federal grant. And in order to get that money, the hospital had to promise that not only would it have an inpatient unit, it would have an outpatient clinic, it would have a night care center, it would have a daycare center. The idea providing a whole spectrum of services across the community. And so later on, I'm now in practice, what am I going to do? There is no psychiatric inpatient at Bronson Hospital, and yet I had interned there, and my first office was at the Bronson Medical Center, but I'm on the medical staff at both hospitals, and on the list at the emergency room that if somebody comes in, it will one day be my call to, do I hospitalize this person or do I not? So, or whatever else are we going to provide for them? And that was the way the community was sort of running early on in my time in practice. Another piece of it was, eventually, the hospitals cooperated, and they got involved in medical education. Kalamazoo had been listed as a community campus for the Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. So students there would spend their first 2 years doing basic sciences and then be farmed out to a variety of communities for further training, for further medical. And Kalamazoo was one of those sites. So that was the Kalamazoo Center for Medical Studies. Let's see. Oops, what did I just do, Nancy?
Yeah.
So here's the cast of characters. Maybe in 1980, we're outside our house with a newly added addition to the back of the house, and with son Matt, daughter Betsy, and Deb. And here we are in October of this last year, gathered now at Friendship Village. And the cast of characters includes Grammy Deb and me, and off to my left shoulder is Rebecca. Rebecca Ferrugia is my daughter-in-law, and Matt graduated University of Michigan with a major in film studies, whatever that meant. He and his friend took off from Kalamazoo with all of their possessions and made their way south, and the trailer broke down somewhere before they got to Texas. They limped into Austin, where he worked as a production assistant in the independent film industry in Austin. And although that relationship ended, he was in the Newton Boys and a film called Office Space, which later became a television series. So he worked on those things, and at some point came back to Kalamazoo to get together with a friend and write film scripts, eventually producing something that may have been described as a mockumentary, a history of the Kalamazoo River and the failure of the city to clean it up. That there were a series of dams from Lake Michigan all the way down to Kalamazoo that were polluted with HIV, what was the name of the?
Ebola.
With, no, there was a three-letter word for the ink solvent that built up and is still present, contaminating those waters. At any rate, during that time, he met Becca. Becca's from Windsor, and she had graduated with a PhD from the University of Iowa in something called communication. She was by this time an assistant professor at Western Michigan University in communication, and her dissertation for her PhD at Iowa was something about women disc jockeys. So she represented a world that we didn't know very much about, but it fit with our son's interests. And by now they have 2 children, and my granddaughter Megan is 17, a high school senior in Westerville, Ohio, and applying for nursing school at Western Michigan University. I think my daughter has the idea of positioning one of her kids there to keep an eye on her parents. Her brother is standing right over Grammy Dev's left shoulder, and that's Ryan, and he's 15. Matt and Becca have 2 sons. So Betsy is now to the right of Grammy Dev, and behind her is husband Mark Hamlin. And Mark has been in government in Ohio now for some time, and is actually the governor's person heading up the COVID testing operation for the state of Ohio. So we hear lots about that. Behind Grammy Dev's right shoulder is daughter Betsy. That's Mark's, and Mark is behind her. To the left of Grammy Dev are the 2 grandsons from the Detroit area, Leland and Huxley, who are, Huxley is 10, fifth grader, and Leland just hit 13. So we imagine they're in for some trouble. But that's the cast of characters. And I want to sort of look at a whole timeline by numbers on the left. When I was out of medical school, I worked as a surgical orderly and scrub technician at Lutheran Hospital in Fort Wayne for a year or so. And some of my father's friends were docs there, and I would hear the surgeons and the anesthesiologists in what was called the gas chamber complaining mostly about the government. And what was the government going to do? And what was all this about socialized medicine? And that's going to ruin everything, and so forth. At some point, a Canadian thoracic surgeon took me to one side and he said, if the government takes it over, at least I'm going to get paid for my work. And I'm not going to get paid in chickens and corn by the farmers around here. So a perspective of that was present for me in the early 60s. It was in 1965 that Medicare became law, and the medical community was storming about that for a long time. And if you fast forward 35, 40 years, we have Obamacare, with much controversy in the intervening 35, 40 years, much of my time in medical practice. So, we're going to get past the tornado in a moment, and a National Leadership Conference. So I want to talk a little bit about my training, about theories of psychiatry and so forth. When I was in Ann Arbor for my residency, nearby Detroit was a psychoanalytic institute. And much of my training about doing psychotherapy was built in the psychoanalytic tradition. At the time, we would hear about behaviorism. And I'd sort of learned that Western Michigan University was a hotbed of behavioral ideas. And so the conflict about how do you sit and talk with people, and what do you say, and how active to be, was a part of all of that controversy and uncertainty. In Ann Arbor, at the residence level, there was an adjacent building called the Mental Health Research Institute. And actually, it was an interesting building. It was on 3 floors, and it had been constructed by a fellow named James Miller, who was from Chicago, and he'd written a book about living systems. And his idea was that he was going to put the biologically oriented research on the basement level, the individual oriented research on the first level, and on the second level would be systems, social systems, with the idea that all those kinds of people would interact with each other and have lunch together and get to talking together. So James Miller wrote this book called Living Systems, and actually the illustrations in the book were done by a medical student named James Van Hare, who had been an industrial artist in his training. And later he went into general practice in Kalamazoo, Michigan for many years. I see Martha Beverly nodding.
He was my doctor.
Her doctor.
He was my doctor.
Okay, another, there you go. So what goes around, what comes around goes around, right? So that's a painting by James Van Hare. And, but the point was, the point of the book is, how is a city, for instance, like a cell? What are the various components of it, and how do you put those pieces together to be able to describe these systems in some general way? So that's James Miller, who went on to be the president of Louisville Medical School, I think, for the rest of his career. In the 1980s, the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry in Rochester, New York, tried to address the question of all of the conflict in psychiatry between the diagnostic labels and the treatments that we put out there, and tried to pull things together. And he tied it together in the label, the biopsychosocial model, which sort of led the thinking about psychiatry for many years. Okay, so settled in Kalamazoo, and somewhere early on, I'm aware of controversy in the community, wars between the hospitals. Somewhere in the 80s, each of the hospitals turned out to need a new administrator at the same time. And they hired two hospital administrators who came in, and they got together with each other and said, why are we fighting all the time? Can we not merge these systems? And they came very close to doing it. In the meantime, I had written a series of essays for the monthly journal about all of the conflicts that were going on and about the community and how things went. Well, my punishment for that was being elected president of the County Medical Society. And so the picture up on the right is of one of those bulletins, and although you can't see it, the photograph was of something I put together, of photographs of Borges Hospital and Bronson Hospital with some glue trying to stick them together. That effort failed, as many will remember some of this, and it failed because the bishop nixed it. He said, we cannot have our hospitals involved in anything that may have anything to do with abortion, no matter what purposes that was held. So it died during that time. I had rented an office at Bronson Medical Center. Steve Young came along, and he had graduated from Indiana the year I had, after I had. I didn't know him very well at the time. But he came to share office space with me. That little office at the Bronson Medical Center was way too small for the two of us, especially when he would go in the room and turn out the light after I had left, and do other things that were somewhat irritating. So we moved to a Doc Heiser's Centennial office, surgical suite on Burdick Street, right across from the Rex Cafe and the State Theater. It's a wonderful old building there. And we practiced there for the next few years until May 13th of 1980, was it? I'm sitting in my office with a patient and starting to hear sirens going off, and eventually debris floating in the air outside, and thought we went to the tenant at Van Werden House, which was held in the office was contained there, and went to the basement to wait out the tornado. Following the tornado, I came up for air, went to the hospital to see what I was supposed to be responding to as a member of the medical staff, and thought people are going to want to talk about this. I need to be prepared for people coming to see me to talk about what had happened to them. Nobody came. I didn't have anybody visit me. People came for other reasons, but not. Eventually, a man came, and his business had been blown away by the tornado, and I asked him whether he ever had troubles with depression before, and he said, "Oh yeah, when the tornado came before, I was a mess for months." But mostly that was not true. People picked up the pieces and went on. In my office, I moved. Maybe nobody else was moving their business, but I had heard about an architect who had built a house, an office out on Peeler Street by the YMCA, and I rented 1,700 square feet of office space there, and invited people to join me. One of them was Steve Young. Another was Hal Reeves, who was a psychologist and the son of a pediatrician with the Upjohn Company. So Hal and I, and along came Bob Strum, who had been a resident in Bronson Hospital, and then had gone off to do psychiatric training in Rochester, New York. So the secretary is answering the phone. Dunstone, Young, Reeves, and Strum. We were not incorporated. The attorney I talked to said he thought we needed to be making more money than we were in order to incorporate. So I was renting booths in a psychiatric bazaar. And we practiced there for some time. All along the way, we're hearing more about managed care, more about computers, more about, eventually about electronic records. So the learning curve is a pretty steep one to figure out how to keep going, especially when you're in business for yourself and you don't know very much about running a business for yourself. As County Medical Society president, I get a call from Richard Light, grandson of W.E. Upjohn, who had gone to medical school and had gotten a residency in neurosurgery and had never done neurosurgery. He asked to meet with me, and when we did that, he showed me the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which featured Kalamazoo, Michigan, and featured a war between these two hospitals in which each had their own helicopters and would go out to I-94 to an accident where dueling helicopters would show up. And Dr. Light said, "This is crazy. This cannot go on. This is terrible for the community." And he set about trying to do something about that. And one of the things that came out of that was the Cancer Center, the Kalamazoo Center for Medical Studies, a contract between Michigan State University and the two hospitals to create that KCMS thing and flesh it out. And so that was some of the politics that was going on at the time. In 1990, so another quick story. One day the phone rings and I'm hearing my secretary laughing. "What's up?" "I got a call from the Menninger Clinic. They said our fax is down." And I said, "We don't have a fax. We don't even have touch-tone phones." Well, that says a little bit about how advanced we were at that point in time, right? So in 1993, Steve Young, one of my associates, was approached by Michigan State University chairman of the Department of Psychiatry saying, "Why don't we hire you? And why don't you start teaching medical students? And along the way, you have more facilities in Kalamazoo for a residency program than most residency programs. Why don't you start a residency program?" So in 1993, we moved, joined the Michigan State University Kalamazoo Center for Medical Studies, and stayed in their same offices and began doing that. I'm now supposed to be an academician, right? Let's see. Back in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm the son of a psychiatrist. Christmas Day was a difficult thing for my sister and I because we'd spend about 20 minutes opening our presents, and my father would spend about 45 minutes opening his presents from doctors and their families and one thing or another that he had taken care of under something called professional courtesy. He would not charge them for whatever he did. So I'm in practice a few years later thinking I'm going to do the same thing. After Thanksgiving, we would put my father on a train and he would go off to New York City and he would give board exams and go to plays like Peter Pan while there. So we'd hear about this going on, and after I'm in practice, I discovered that the same meeting that he was going to was continuing, the Association for Research in Nervous and Mental Diseases. And it would be a meeting in which papers were presented to neurologists and psychiatrists from international studies and local studies, and I'd get back on the plane or whatever after going to this meeting, my head full of change, and whether it's going to be meaningful or not, what's really happening with all of this. One of the characters that we eventually showed up at was somebody called Eric Kandel, who some of you may have heard won a Nobel Prize for figuring out a little bit about the molecular biology of memory, how memory works, and training California sea snails to withdraw from something, and how was the circuitry in the brain affected by that. Another character there was somebody named Oliver Sacks, who would come in every so often, a British guy, rode a motorcycle, and he'd written a number of books, one of which was Awakenings. Well, Awakenings was about Parkinson's, kind of, or about the discovery of L-DOPA to treat Parkinson's, but it was in a population of people who had been in the flu epidemic of the 1920s, and 20 years later had begun having difficulties with mobility. A long-term, you're standing there, so I need to be done.
No,
Oh, okay.
I'm just checking the video.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. And so Oliver Sacks writes beautifully, and he writes about this population of people who 20 years earlier had had this infection. Let me move along with that for a moment. While I'm in Kalamazoo, in my office, in the morning, I would go to Borges Hospital and see patients on the inpatient psychiatric hub. Occasionally, I would see patients in consultation. And at some point in there, we're going to talk about AIDS because of people I would see I want to talk about that, and the experience of seeing people who were involved in that illness. So, Bronson Hospital. There was a neurologist who had come to town named Richard Foa, and he and I one of the few neurologists that I could talk with. We seemed to communicate well with each other. And he offered me to help join him in Bronson Hospital in creating a neurologic rehabilitation program. What I brought to that as a psychiatrist to say, we're going to see people with new injuries, head injuries, cancer, whatever, and a team would see them. And the team would be a social worker, a nurse, a chaplain, a psychiatrist, maybe, a neurologist. And once a week, we would meet as a team, and I got to say the rules, and the rules were we're all equal players here. We will not use jargon to hide behind to talk about these things. And we'll try to come up with some approaches using these various modalities that will have the best possible outcome for these patients. That was a wonderful experience. It was a lot of fun to do that. Eventually the program moved out to Vicksburg, to the small hospital here, and continues. And there's a similar one that Borges had been running, now Ascension Health. But that's neuro rehab. We also did a little thing called med psych program for a while, trying to take patients within the medical community who had concomitant psychiatric disorders, treat them until the State Department of Mental Health called us on the carpet and said, you're trying to run a psychiatric unit without a license. You have to stop. Wonder who called them. We thought maybe the hospital across the way had called them to do that. So that was a couple of other programs. But in 1993, income was leveling off. Managed care and insurance issues were huge. And we were having increasing difficulty with that. We decided to join the medical education group, KCMS, and the challenge for me was to try to become an academician, whatever that meant. So I took a big interest over time. The picture on the left shows you a picture of a brain. In the process of all that committee work at the hospital, I received a catalog from the Carolina Biologics Supply House that took me back to undergraduate days and said, oh, I want to buy that model of a brain. Now I'm sitting in my office talking with people and occasionally say, how does this happen? Where is this depression in this thing? Where is your anxiety disorder in this model? Eventually the question is, how does it work? What's happening in there? And over the last 15, 20 years, this has become an increasingly important conversation across the world, right, about neuroscience. So, I get the punishment for writing the ads, the articles in the bulletin by President of the Medical Society. The American Medical Association calls together the county medical society presidents once a year for a workshop in Chicago. And I was invited to that in 1988. The lead speaker was an assistant to the Surgeon General of the United States, a fellow called C. Everett Koop. And this person described an epidemic that was sweeping across the country that we needed to know about, in which everybody who gets it dies. They will have no vaccine for at least 5 years. We know of no treatments. What are we going to do in our communities to try to deal with this thing, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS? And I'm sitting there thinking, gee, I have an 11-year-old daughter at home, a 14-year-old son. I'm supposed to go back and tell them about anal sex? I'm supposed to tell them. At what level do you need to inform the public so that they will be able to take the measures to deal with things? So, there's another epidemic that many of you will remember. Later in that workshop, there is a conference put on by a fellow named Eigelhart, who was the international correspondent for the New England Journal of Medicine. And John Eigelhart talked about healthcare in England, France, Norway, and Germany, and the United States, comparing. I was so taken with what I was hearing with the comparison of healthcare in these countries that I went up at the intermission and introduced myself, and he said, well, you're from Kalamazoo. I played in the junior boys tennis tournament in Kalamazoo, Michigan. If you want to teach, if you want us to help train your doctors about what's going on, we'll be happy to come and do that. Ted Cooper will pay for it. Well, Ted Cooper wasn't going to pay for that. He was the president of Upjohn at the time. But Eigelhart was interesting, and his journal was built around the other international journal, Faculty of Foreign Affairs. His journal is Health Affairs. And really, it was creating the whole concept of healthcare and how do we talk about that as an industry. So I'm up there asking him, and I say, this is interesting, but I don't understand the language in which this is talked about. There's almost a chorus of other doctors around me saying, well, you surely read Paul Starr's Social Transformation of American Medicine. Write down that name. No, I had not, but did. And Paul Starr had written the history of medicine and what had been happening over the last 100 years in terms of power and sovereignty and systems. And the quote from that is the coming of this is the corporatization, the industrialization of medical care. The great illusion of physicians and the hospital industry in the 1970s was that liberal government was causing us troubles. The real threat to their autonomy lay in the demand they were placing on private health insurance as well as public programs. So, reframing the whole discussion about what was happening with medical care. 1986, Hal Reams, practicing together, we'd have lunch together. We'd sometimes talk about doctors and how doctors were trained. Were they trained to deal with all these changes in medical practice and with the medical student? So we hatched a research project because he wanted to do some kind of research. We sent letters to 20 local physicians, a sample picked from different practice types, different specialties. We tried to pick people who were not seen as being within 5 years of retirement, but had been in practice for at least 5 years. And I went to their offices or their homes with a tape cassette recorder and interviewed them and asking them, what do you see as the major changes in medicine over the last 5 to 10 years? How are you reacting to it? How are your colleagues reacting to it? Because of what was going on at the time, and there were malpractice insurance problems. Have you ever been sued? What was that like? What do you think is the major motivation of somebody going into medicine? And we listened to these tapes over and over again, eventually putting together a paper that was sent to the New England Journal of Medicine and got rejected right away. We sent it to JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and they said, no, not us, but maybe one of our subsidiary journals, and happened to send it to the Archives of Internal Medicine and got exactly the right reviewer, who said, not this, but here's how you write this paper. And the title of it became Professional Satisfaction of Physicians. The sample, it turned out to be 19, could be divided into 4 parts. There was one doc who said, what problems? There aren't any problems, this is great. About a third of the rest said, there are great problems, but I can figure it out, I'm okay. There are huge problems, and I can't wait to get out. And this is all good. So that was the paper. By now, I'm becoming an academician, and 10 years later, I do a follow-up study of that same group, and that was published in an international journal. So that's what's up there. In the meantime, we've gotten involved in a number of other activities having to do with residency education and national groups about that. One of the problems in Kalamazoo is what credibility does this small community have on the national scene? So joining some larger organizations made sense of what to do with all of that. And I would go to those meetings and somehow find time to practice. In 2010, I got a note from a social worker, a sociologist at Rutgers, saying, you know that study you did? What have you done about that? Well, I hadn't done anything about that. She said, that's the longest longitudinal study in the literature. You should do some more with it. So we got together and talked to the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, and they said, if you're going to do that, you need a comparison group. And I went to the original 19 docs, of whom 7 were still in practice, and 6 agreed to be videotaped interviewed. So I went to their offices and did that. Find out what they were thinking then, and chose another group and began interviewing them. But in the meantime, I'm moving towards retirement. And so I hand off the project to one of our residents who's going to become a faculty member, and then a year later get a phone call from the psychiatrist head of the research thing saying, remember that study? Can we destroy that data? Nothing's been done about that. Well, I wasn't eager to do that. So I geared up and tried to retool myself. And a dean for faculty affairs at the new medical school became interested in this, recruited a couple of her faculty members, and they began meeting with me to look at this data that I had collected to see if they could write another paper. Last April, Karen Hornifer-Ginter, a psychologist, and I did a video presentation for an international conference on physician health in London. So that sort of pulled all of that to fruition, right? So the group of us have been meeting, trying to come up with another paper, and along the way, medicine has changed significantly over this time. I asked about what books were out there now to learn what's the medical world like now. And 3 books were recommended to me. One is by Jonathan Bush, who is of the Bush family. He's a grandson of the former president Bush, one of the former presidents Bush. And he had been an ambulance attendant and looked at what was going on in medicine as a business opportunity. He was busy creating management systems, finance systems, insurance schemes, and electronic medical records. And he would go to hospitals in the Atlanta area saying, my company, Athena Health, will come in and manage obstetrics for you. So the corporatization of medicine is continuing in all of these ways. And Jonathan Bush writes about that. His comment is, what should happen with doctors in the future? They should become entrepreneurs. 2 authors, Hyman and Silver, from the Cato Institute, studied medicine and wrote a book called Overcharged, in which they claimed that the medical systems were a mess. There was waste throughout the system. Too much medication was being done. It needed to be done in different ways. And the answer to all of that, when hundreds of millions of people spend their own money on health care, they will behave differently, and health care providers will too. That sounds a little like behavior modification adapted to an economic system. The 3rd book is by Topol, who was a cardiologist at the Scripps Institute in La Jolla. And he goes back to the 1930s to an economist who talks about systems that will eventually collapse of their own cumbersomeness and so forth, and talks about constant connectivity, collaboration, crowdsourcing, all of these concepts that frankly are so new to me that I don't understand them very well. But that just in the long run for him was, our healthcare system is broken and needs to change. And all this within the frame of the new Affordable Care Act, of what's going on. And part of what I'm here about with us is we're all consumers of this system now, and I don't know how much we need to know about what's going on in healthcare to be able to make our way forward. So what's the relevance of all of this to us? I'm not sure I have the answers to that, but I'm eager to hear from all of you. And the other thing, for some of you, I've been on within a few conversations. If you listen to me, if you think about my part in that, I'm often asking about the care you've gotten. How is it going? Are you having trouble finding care? Are you able to follow that? Is this long-term care retirement community doing what it can to forward things? So that's been kind of an agenda of mine, and I guess we'll continue to do it. It's very personal. So, plagues. We got together with about our 50th wedding anniversary with a former roommate in Bloomington, Indiana, and another guy who had been at our wedding, and he's a retired chair of obstetrics and gynecology from a hospital system in St. Louis. So we're hanging out together. And along the way, I find myself remembering that at age 16, I was a Boy Scout, and I went to a national jamboree in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and then on to an international Boy Scout Jubilee Jamboree in Sutton Coldfield, England, a suburb of Manchester, I think. Following the Boy Scout thing, we were taken on a tour of Europe. It was about 5 days. And the first stop was Lucerne, Switzerland. How many of you have been to Lucerne? There's a lot of water there, and there are mountains. And there is a long covered bridge you can walk along with the joists at the ceiling of that being with a wooden panel as you walk along, and there are oil paintings on those wooden panels. And this dates to 12 or 1300, to the medieval times. And the panels, one of them is reproduced here, are the story of the plague, the Danse Macabre. So plagues keep showing up in my history as we go along with things. AIDS, polio. I remember taking a sugar cube in grade school, right? So I remember in medical school on the second floor of Riley Hospital in Indianapolis, stumbling into a room where there were probably 50 iron lungs. Anyway, so if you've seen the oil paintings on the bridge, it was all about the plague. And in a lot of ways, we're still dealing with plagues. I remember in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, going to see patients in the hospital who seemed to be delirious and being very badly behaved because this virus seemed to go to the brain first. In the flu epidemic, that virus had gone to the brain, and 20 or 30 years later, people were developing Parkinson's. And this virus seems to go to the brain as well. And who knows what kinds of long-term things we may experience from some of this. So the idea of plagues was interesting. My son at 13 decided, when he was 4, he and I had seen the first Star Wars movie together. And he decided at age 13 he was going to write a paper for an English class about the Star Wars trilogy as a medieval morality play. We went to the library and looked up Everyman, which is by an anonymous author. And among other things about the plague, there in that I found this poem that I ended up using to teach doctors and medical students about engaging. If I to you my heart should break, and you to turn your mind from me, and would not me comfort when you hear my speak, then would I 10 times sorrier be. So a message from the medical students and my residents. I think I should. So there's one more piece of this I want to bring to your attention for a minute. I was at an annual staff dinner at Borges Hospital a number of years ago, and sitting around from other docs who had all come at about the same time. And one of them said to me, "So I hear the University of Michigan is going to build a depression center in Kalamazoo." And I thought, oh no, I don't know anything about that. I can't imagine that that's going to happen. Tell me more about this. So there was a woman named Susan Brown, who's a very enthusiastic Michigan supporter, married to Bob Brown, who I think was the captain of the football team, or maybe the basketball team. And she had gotten concerned with a number of her friends about people who had suicided that she knew. And she thought this was a terrible thing. What were we doing about suicide in Kalamazoo? What more could we do about that? A granddaughter of Upjohn, named Mary Meader, had been in Ann Arbor as a patient, and she was having difficulties with depression, and gave them something like $13 million for the care that she received, and they began a depression center as a result of that. Now Susan Brown is saying they'll do that in Kalamazoo. No, they weren't going to do that. There was another program that had started in which child and adolescent psychiatrists from their department could be called by pediatricians in Kalamazoo with difficult patients and run that patient by them and get a sort of bedside, curbside consult and manage the patients that way. So eventually we began having meetings, money being donated, and in the meantime in in the state of Washington, the University of Washington, there had been a program that had been, a study that had been done by some nurses and social workers in which they had worked with primary care offices, asked them to, with new patients, to do the PHQ-9, the Patient Health Questionnaire, 9 questions, some of which lead to questions about mood and depression. And they had done that with a set of new patients, had approached the primary care doc with those who had a high depression rating on those things and asked if they could help him treat them. And I'm being cued to show you this. If they could treat that with the help of a case manager. So the case manager would start to create a medical record of what they were doing with all of this and followed it. And in the long run, what they discovered was that they were successful at treating depression in a community that had very little access to psychiatrists, and instead this was a consultant. And that not only were their depression treated, but the other indicators of health, eye care, diabetic care, cardiac problems, all improved as well. So this sounded like an interesting thing, and nationally it's been more common, called a collaborative care project. And in Kalamazoo, that's how this has evolved. And at the time that I retired 5 years ago, I was still active with this, but my colleague Perry Westerman, some of you know his mother here, took it over, and he's been managing that. So the Kalamazoo Collaborative Care Program is there at the Western Michigan University Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine. And then we moved to Kalamazoo. And Deb, I'm going to stop. Okay, I'm done, and I'll be glad to have questioning and questions or answer if we have any time left.
Does anybody have any questions? Here, see, I got the mic.
Okay, you might know. Are you satisfied with the health care that's being provided in Kalamazoo with the two systems that we seem to be married to now? So few physicians actually staying in private practice. Probably a lot of that has to do with their being sued and whatnot. They're going under the umbrella. And I'll tell you what I think of it. I think it is much poorer than what we had before when we had people in private practice.
Okay, thank you. So this study that we did of 19 docs, none of those were, all of those were in private practice. The hospitals had almost no doctors who were employees. Now the two systems in Kalamazoo, Ascension Health with Borges and Bronson, there is no private practice in medicine anymore. The question about quality of care, the hospitals have tried to respond to some questions about that and set up surveys to figure out what was going on and do it in a logical and consistent kind of way. I only get anecdotal information from people here and in the community. Of course, there are competing systems not only in Kalamazoo, but in Grand Rapids and the University of Michigan and Michigan State and so forth. And many people for years have gone off to Chicago or Cleveland Clinic for specialty care, and that continues on. I don't know what kind of dipstick I can have that will help me know what quality of care is. I'm going to hear more from you folks about what you think.
Can I follow up on
Yes.
just one thing? I have a 6-month checkup coming up, and my doctor is in the Bronson group. Some of it's kind of nice because they seem to be well organized, and you can go online and see what's up, and they will do nice things for you. However, And I like my doctor very much. He was in private practice and then he went with this group. Now I get everything online. They email me and remind me of my appointment and, oh, by the way, you can check in online and blah, blah, blah. But then somewhere in there that says your appointment will be 60 minutes. I know from past experience that half of that 60 minutes is going to be our retiring to another room and my watching him enter the data in a computer. So 15 minutes of that 60 minutes is actually our analyzing what my blood work was and blah, blah, blah. We're talking about this and that, if I have any special problems. 15 minutes. And he is on a schedule, and he is going to stick to that 15 minutes if he possibly can. My other doctor, before he retired, sometimes my appointment would be 15 minutes. That's all it would take. Sometimes what was happening in my life took 15 more minutes of his time. At the end of it, every time, he always asked me, how's it going at home? Sometimes that was a good question to ask, and sometimes it was a bad one. But he considered part of his care my mental, where I
Well-being,
was.
a sense of well-being.
Where I was. I'm not getting that. And it's not because of my doctor, it's simply because, and if I have a problem that requires a specialist, I feel that he has to go to the specialists that are in the Bronson group. If he knows of a specialist who could really take care of me from Grand Rapids or wherever, he isn't going to recommend that person.
Yes.
And I'm done talking, I'm sorry.
No, thank you, that's eloquent. It covers a lot of that territory. You step back to the Friendship Village thing. One of the buzzwords about being here is being independent and about having autonomy, right? We get to say lots of things. And that's true within the physician world as well. If you interview them and ask how's it going, they may say, I hate this. I hate being controlled by how much time I have with the patient or one thing or another. So the quality of their work life has shifted, but in the whole, they're comfortable with what they're happy with what they're doing and the decisions they're making. They seem to be. But you put your finger on exactly one of the significant concerns, and I think you go to the new head of Bronson Systems or to Ascension Health and ask them. They're having these questions asked of themselves all the time.
I came from Canada, so I was used to a universal medical system
Yes.
from 1962 on. And when I moved here, I knew that what I was going to do was always have the best health insurance possible while I was here. And so when I retired, I got a plan that I pay more than probably everybody in this room does. But I never have to write a check, I never have to deal with paperwork of any kind. So when I think about quality of care, I know that I am getting the very best because the doctors and the nurses don't have to say, oh yeah, she can only get, let's see, 3 physical therapies because of the way her insurance works. I got 20 all in a row. Few people are entitled to that, but I am. So I think that part of the system has to do with us not having universal health care. Another thing, doctors in Canada, when we finally got this thing rolling and was really going, I testified in Montreal on behalf of one of my neighbors about doctoring. And it was found that doctors in Canada make as much money as doctors here do, but we have universal health care. Right? So, in my quality of care here, I've had lots since 2015. I've been very ill, had tons of specialists and all sorts of people. I've had wonderful care. My best care is at Bronson. Unfortunately, I had been with Borges and I had to let it go because they were not sending my medical records over to Bronson when I asked them to. So I was so sorry I had to leave Borges because I had my primary care doctor there, but on set. And I encourage people to look at the insurance and to encourage a universal care. The rest of the developed world has it, and I
Right.
think we should too.
We visited with my son's wife's family, and they're from Windsor, and we were talking about some of the same stuff, and Tony pulled out his billfold, and he showed me a chip on his billfold that contained his entire medical record
Yeah.
that he could take anywhere, and it would all be done. So the electronic record is interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you to David. It's all appreciate. Very informative discussion. Very interesting. Just so everyone knows, next month we have For Life Stories on May 4th, Jerry James, and the title of her presentation is Once Upon a Time. So we look forward to that. Thank you all for being here today and supporting the program.
So, no, so Deb, incidentally, Deb is going to be doing a talk towards the end of this month about a project of hers, so come to that too.
Oh, yeah.